behaviors. And before I go into this, I wanted to just show how there's this variety of cooperative behaviors that we see in adults. So we are willing to provide food to others, help others who are in major trouble. We donate money, we even donate our own blood. We engage in cooperative behaviors where people will not be able to achieve these goals when just one person is acting individually, but when we work as groups, as teams, we are able to achieve quite outstanding things like building these buildings in which we are sitting right now. And we also have very strong norms about these kinds of behaviors. So how to share food, or when someone is contributing to work, they feel entitled to get something, especially more than those who did not contribute as much. And so what you can distinguish here are two different types of cooperative behavior. So in psychology, we often call the stuff on the left pro-sociality. So the idea is that you do something not for your immediate benefit, but at the benefit of some other individual, or collaboration with mutualistic payoffs on the other end. And so I show this to explain to you that to understand these kinds of behaviors, we really have to look at the psychology underlying this, because it's just inconceivable to do something like a collaborative act like this one without the sophisticated cognitive and motivational processes that we see in humans. What I want to talk about today is in particular pro-social behavior, because this is on giving, and I will first show you some evidence on helping behaviors. So this is facilitating another person's goal fulfillment, and then also present you a little bit on sharing, where someone is giving up a resource on behalf of someone else. And so what I'm doing in my line of research is to look at the origins of these behaviors. And the reason we look at the origins is that we can really understand better something about the conditions under which these kinds of things emerge. And a very strong claim that people make is that these pro-social behaviors are maybe imposed by the social environment. So it is necessary that children internalize norms. They start out selfish and then have to, in some sense, be reprogrammed by culture to, in addition to all the selfish stuff that we do, to occasionally also act pro-socially. And the limitation for this claim is that most of the evidence that norms matter for people and so forth comes from research with adults and school-age children who have already gone through this long socialization process. And the alternative is that maybe there is a predisposition that we find early in development that does not depend on these socialization processes, knowing what's right and following what your parents told you and so forth. And this is what I will focus on here to show that maybe there is something very early and untouching. And so in the first part, we'll talk a little bit about early forms of pro-sociality that we find between 1 and 2 years of age, and then talk a little bit about what might be the factors, especially cultural norms and the social cognitive development, that then contributes to the expansion of this pro-social behavior that we see very early on. Okay? So this will have 2 parts. In the first part, I will talk about helping behaviors in children. I will be very illustrative, so I will not talk about all the control conditions that we ran and so forth, but rest assured we have done all the work, so please refer to our papers on that or the discussion later on. So to illustrate the phenomenon, what we did, for example, was we have a situation where there's an adult who is hanging up towels on a clothesline, and then a clothespin drops on the floor while an 18-month-old toddler is observing that. And so the finding is that 18-month-olds will spontaneously help in these situations. No parent is telling them to do it. The experimenter is not really requesting it from them. They're not rewarding them, and still they do it. And to just show how flexible this helping is, it holds not only true for simple behaviors like picking up clothespins, it also occurs in this situation where first I put magazines into a cabinet and then I close the door to get another stack of magazines, and then this happens. And so what we find in these kinds of studies is that these social cognitive skills in toddlers are enable very flexible forms of helping. So they can help with various goals and different kinds of intervention, removing physical obstacles, picking things up, using the correct tool if the other one uses the wrong one, and stuff like that. So this tells us a lot about their cognitive or social cognitive ability to read goals. But what about their motivation? So one thing is that maybe they do it when it's not very costly to them, you just have to pick something up. But look at this example. So here the toddler is in this ball pool having fun, and the experimenter is also dropping something, as we saw before. So this is just one example of many in which we show that people are putting some effort into helping. They also pay opportunity costs. When they can play a fun game, they're willing to leave it behind in order to help, and they do that over and over and over again. So this is the side of cost. So they're willing to pay some cost. But what about benefits? So a possibility is that they expect to receive a reward, and that drives their behavior. However, we have manipulated this many times. They help without getting a reward over like 18 trials or 2 sessions, and they help not at a higher rate when we offer them a reward every time they help. And I want to show you that actually this can have a detrimental effect. So when we ran a study where first children, one group of children never received a reward, and so the experimenter responded neutrally, versus praised them, versus a third group of children received a reward every time they picked up something for the experimenter. When these 3 groups of children were then tested in a post-test without a provision of any reward, we found this result, that children in the neutral, in the praise condition, continue to help at a very high rate, but children in the reward condition, when no reward was forthcoming, were now less likely to help. So this is, for social psychology, the over-justification effect, or for behavioral economics, that would be crowding out. So it seems that as long as children are motivated intrinsically to help, rewards can actually have a detrimental effect on their behavior. So to summarize, rewards can even undermine their pro-social behavior. And then the last piece is, you might have noticed that there are these very strong cues about the problem, and so the question is whether children will help without someone is going like, which can be interpreted as like, help me, please help me, so that the person is soliciting that. So we were wondering if children beyond what we could call reactive prosociality also show proactive prosociality. And this is the setup here. So in this case, the child is watching how an experimenter is putting away cans, but she turns her back towards the child and does not even see the problem, where a can is rolling down and falling on the ground.
The big box. Put that here. Here's a small one. Put that here. And then here's another one, see, we do the same size. Put that here. And this one here.
All right, so what we find is that children help even with the experimenter signaling anything about the problem. So they're really proactively motivated to help. And they do that even when the parent is not there, right? And so we actually manipulated that. The parent is telling them to help or is not even there or whatever. It just has no effect. So it really seems to be something that is between the child and the experiment. Yes?
So question, how many children do this out of 1 year? This picking up and
So the rates vary a little bit, but it's usually the majority of children who do that. I mean, what we do is the main point is to compare to a control condition, and so that is the main point. But it's so in these experiments, usually 9% of children help at least once, and then the rate of helping is that really depends on the study. When it's costly, it's a little bit lower. If it's not so costly, it's a little bit higher. If it's very easy to understand the problem, it's near 90%. If it's more complicated, like the cabinet task, it's maybe around 50%. Yes?
An interesting question. What is the point of experimenting in the room? If something just fell off the shelf.
Right. That's a very good point. Right. But we have a control condition in which the experimenter is doing it on purpose. So is discarding the can on purpose, and there they don't pick it up. So it doesn't seem like they just think generally things don't belong on the floor, they belong on the table, because then they would do that as well. So that's the difference. Okay, let me move on, because I have one complex of stuff that is, I think, especially interesting for you guys here. So just to summarize real quick, we found these early forms of pro-sociality. Now I want to look at what might influence these kinds of behaviors, and we'll do that on sharing behaviors. And so when, as I mentioned earlier, we think about how these pro-social behaviors might emerge, a very good candidate for how this emerges, or at least increases, is due to social learning. And we know that imitation plays a major role for all kinds of culturally relevant behaviors. And more generally speaking, parents are regarded as a central piece in this equation. But it's surprising, but we'll hear another example later on, that there are no experiments that we could find that are specifically targeting parental modeling and their influence on children's sharing. And so this is what we did. This is I worked with Peter Blake in particular, and Tara Callaghan, a colleague of mine. And so what we did is we looked at parental modeling, but did it cross-culturally, and took advantage of the fact that Tara Callaghan is able to test children in India, which is particularly interesting for us because there is this well-known distinction between individualism and collectivism, or interdependence and independence and interdependence. And so we were thinking that maybe in the India sample, it is more likely that parents play a role for the children than in the more individualistic society in Boston. So what we did is we ran the same experiment both in India, in Andhra Pradesh, and in Boston. And I want to show you how this works. So we play a dictator game where the parent, this is the actual parent of the kid, is demonstrating how she would share these cough drops, like adult candy, into two bags. One is the bag that she will take home. The other bag is the bag that would go to an anonymous other adult. Right. So this is how it works. I'm going to point out this is in public parks, a great recruitment tool. So we can test like 300 children in one summer to do that. Impossible to do in a lab study. And so what we manipulate is that we have these kids at 3 to 8 years of age, and it's a dictator game with candy, where we're manipulating between subject whether the children see a generous model, so that the parent is giving 9 and keeping 1, or they see a stingy model who gives 1 and keeps 9, or they don't see what the parent did. They know that the parent did something, but they didn't see what the distribution was. And then we measure how children will distribute candy between themselves and an anonymous other child in a privacy box. So nobody sees that, but obviously we record it later on. And this is the result. So that in Boston, the children are not deviating in the generous condition from the baseline kids, but the stingy children are maybe a little bit influenced in negative. And this holds true over development. So that is for all age groups, we found that the generous model had 0 effect. If anything, the stingy model reduced the sharing rate. And what I also want to point out is that even though the parent is modeling 9, they never go above 50%. Almost never. On average, never. And so when we look at the India kids, we find that early on, there's also not a strong effect of modeling, or not at all. But over development, it increases. And you can see that it leads to more sharing in the generous condition and less sharing in the stingy condition. And this effect even becomes greater here. So the point is that there is a model effect, but it emerges over development. And when we look at it in another way, is that you will see that now suddenly these kids are actually giving more than half. So they break through this equality ceiling and become hyper generous. So when you look at this by numbers of children who go above the line or don't, in the US it's a very rare occurrence, but in India the children in the generous condition do that. Okay? So US children ignore hyper generous donations, and children from India show more faithful imitation. There was a question over there?
Yes, I was just wondering if you were to remember different talks and how you were going to randomize the children that are involved.
Randomization, yeah, well, it's just a random assignment to condition. This is pre-select, just a standard form. So that would not be able to, I mean, we didn't randomize India versus US, but the conditions are random.
So if I understand how you did the experiment, you were having the parent, you told the parent what they should do.
That's right. They have a secret instruction sheet.
Right. So,
Yeah.
So I guess the question in my mind is the parent is displaying a behavior that may be very close to what the child naturally observes from the parent, or maybe not. So do you have a measure of that? Because, and you could see from the video, the parent was sort of smiling like, oh, I'm doing something here, you should notice. So
Right.
I'm a little concerned about how we understand these results relative to, the parent being told to do something that could be very much like what they naturally do, or maybe nothing like that.
Right. So I think you will talk about that, right? So maybe we can come back to this, because I think, is it the last presentation? Or the third presentation? There it actually is what would the parents actually do. So we did not assess what is the parental donation. So that's a very good point here, and that we have not assessed this. But this is deliberate, right? We wanted to go beyond that. And if anything, this should create noise, right? If the parents are, that for some children, what the parent is doing is exactly what they expect the parent to do. In other cases, it's totally novel. So this should just create noise in the data, but we can control for that by the random assignment. Can I wrap up very quickly, because I'm almost out of time, and then maybe we can talk about it later. So the point here is that faithful imitation is rare. Children's own preferences prevail. I just say this because when you try to model cultural effects, it seems so important to think about what are the preferences. And we have observed that very often there's just the assumption that people just copy the behavior that they see, but it interacts with their own behavior or preferences. And we find these cross-cultural differences that India children are more influenced, and maybe this collectivism, individualism thing might partly explain it. At least it's congruent with that distinction. Obviously, there are many other factors that could play a role here, so we really need a big cross-cultural study to control for all these kinds of things. But the important thing is also that these socialization factors scale up over development, right? So this is something that children become socialized into socialization in some sense. Okay, so to just conclude real quick, the point is that this line of work can tell us something about early social development, and then we can investigate more closely what are the factors that influence these kinds of behaviors. I've shown you an example where parental modeling did not have a major effect, at least in US kids. So what we're trying to do next is to see what actually matters. So with Anya, I've started a study to see to what extent maybe giving incentives has sometimes positive effects, even though it seems to undermine helping. Maybe with sharing, it's a different story. With my colleague Peter Blake, we're also working on when the children know more about the recipient, maybe they are also more inclined to give something even so that this just seeing what the parent is doing is not very meaningful to them because they don't understand the consequences. So with that, I want to conclude and thank all the funding agencies and all the people who have done the work.
Okay, we have time for one or two questions while the next speaker sets up.
Yes,
I was just wondering, with the modeling study, if you tried it with people other than the parents being the model of generosity, I know my own kids don't care what I do.
Right, that's a very good point. We have not done that, and so the most interesting part would be peers, because that is something that, at least over development, maybe becomes more and more important. I mean, so that would be interesting, especially say for teenagers, where you say that maybe they would do the exact opposite of what the parent did, but really go with the popular peer. So that's a very good question, and we should really investigate this. However, when we think about what are the claims about socialization, I mean, at least there's a large body of work that says parents are instrumental. There are other kinds of models that say, no, actually it's more horizontal. That is more important. And so this would be an interesting way of testing these competing hypotheses.
Another quick question, do you have a place where we can get these people videos and stuff?
Yeah, they're on our website, actually. Yeah. Okay, I think
yeah, so I was just thinking that in the cross-cultural contrast, given that the hyper-generous condition is so strong, that you may sort of be overshooting in the U.S. case, which is sort of related to your point, that you need to think, I mean, it would be interesting to see some variation in the modeling of generous behavior, to see whether, U.S. kids will follow a parent if their behavior is not so far different from what their actual behavior is.
That's right. That's a very good point, and we did do that. We thought, like, they just C9 and see that's crazy, and just totally dismiss that. But when we do 7, it's the same effect. It also doesn't. Yeah. So the one way is just by absolute number. The other is to just the distance from their spontaneous, and it has the same result.
Thank you very much. The next